In the spring of 1870, a federal marshal traveling alone through the Choctaw Nation came across 17 bodies arranged in a perfect circle around a dying campfire. Each man had been shot once between the eyes, and each clutched a single playing card from the same deck in his cold hand. The marshal counted the cards twice before the full meaning of what he was seeing finally dawned on him. The dead were Pinkerton agents, Texas Rangers, bounty hunters, and 3 deputies from his own office in Fort Smith, Arkansas, men who had ridden out together 6 weeks earlier with a single objective: to capture or kill the man the newspapers had started calling the Black Devil of the Red River. They had failed, just like every posse before them, and the cards in their hands spelled out a message in a code the marshal recognized, but could not decipher. A code that would remain unbroken for another 41 years, long after every man who knew its meaning was dead and buried in unmarked graves, scattered across 3 states and the Indian Territory. What the marshal didn't know, what no white lawman would understand for decades, was that the man they were hunting had once been property, sold at auction in Natchez, Mississippi, for $940 to a cotton planter. That planter had branded him on the left shoulder with the initials JW before sending him into the fields at age 11. Before we continue with the story of Jeremiah Walker and the gang that nearly brought the United States government to its knees in the years after the Civil War, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, and tell me in the comments which state you're listening from tonight, because what you're about to hear was buried in classified federal records for over a century, and the descendants of the men involved are still alive in towns from Oklahoma to East Texas. They never wanted this story told. Tonight, we're going to tell it anyway, to understand how a former slave came to lead the most feared outlaw band in the history of the American frontier. You first have to understand the country that created him, a country that had just torn itself apart over whether men like him were human beings or merchandise. The war ended in April of 1865, but along the western edge of the former Confederacy, in the borderlands where Texas met the Indian Territory, and the Indian Territory met Arkansas, the war never really ended. It just changed shape. The Union Army pulled most of its troops out to occupy the deeper South, leaving behind a vast, lawless region nearly the size of France, policed by fewer than 200 federal lawmen. Into that vacuum poured every desperate creature the war had created: Confederate guerrillas who refused to surrender, Union deserters wanted for murder in 3 states, Comanche and Kiowa, raiders pushed off their hunting grounds, Mexican vaqueros displaced by the new Anglo cattle barons, Chinese laborers who had finished the railroads and found themselves friendless in a country that hated them, and tens of thousands of freedmen, emancipated with nowhere to go and nothing to their names, walking west with the clothes on their backs because the South they had known had become a slaughterhouse for any black man caught alone after dark. The town of Boggy Depot sat near the center of this chaos in the Choctaw Nation, about 40 miles north of the Red River. And in the autumn of 1866, it was the kind of place where a man could buy a meal, a horse, or another man's life for roughly the same price. The streets were unpaved, and the buildings were thrown together from green cottonwood that warped and split as it dried, giving every door and window a crooked look, as if the town itself had been built by a drunk who couldn't remember how houses were supposed to fit together. There were 3 saloons. 2 of them were owned by the same Choctaw merchant, Pushmetaha Folsom, a descendant of a famous chief who had grown rich selling whiskey to soldiers during the war and saw no reason to stop selling it to outlaws now that the soldiers had gone home. There was a single store run by a Scottish trader named Angus McCrae, who kept a loaded shotgun under the counter and a Bible on top of it, and who was known to settle disputes with whichever of the two he found closer to hand. There was a livery stable, a blacksmith, and a small adobe building that served as both jail and courthouse for whatever rough justice the Choctaw Lythors police could administer when they bothered to ride through, which was less and less often as the country sank deeper into disorder. Boggy Depot that autumn was not so much a town as a wound that had begun to scar over without healing properly underneath. Wagons rolled in at all hours from the south, from Texas, carrying men who wouldn't give their names and goods no one would ask the provenance of. Wagons rolled out at all hours toward the north, toward Fort Smith, carrying things that had once belonged to other people. The graveyard at the edge of town, on a small rise behind the Methodist mission that had been abandoned since 1863, had grown by 47 new graves in the 18 months since the war ended. Only 9 of them belonged to people who had died of natural causes. The rest had died, as the saying went in that country, of lead poisoning or rope fever, or the kind of accident involving a knife, a back, and a moonless night. The Choctaw Lythors Police, a small body of mounted lawmen authorized by treaty to keep order in the nation, had ridden through twice in the year before. Both times after killings serious enough to embarrass the tribal government in Tuscahoma. Both times they had questioned a few witnesses, found nothing, and ridden away again, leaving Boggy Depot to settle its own accounts in its own way. The mission building still stood at the western edge of town, its roof half collapsed, the heavy oak doors hanging open. Inside, the children of the town and of passing strangers played among the broken pews and the smashed pulpit, occasionally finding a torn page of a hymnal or a fragment of a colored window someone had thought worth shooting at. The smell of the town was a particular smell that anyone who had spent time in such places would have recognized: horse manure, wood smoke, unwashed wool, and cheap whiskey. And beneath all of these, the faint but persistent smell of old blood that had soaked into the earth of certain alleys and wouldn't wash out, no matter how much rain fell. Into this town, on a cold November morning in 1866, walked a black man of about 20 years old, 6'2", lean as a coyote, wearing a Union Army cavalry coat with the chevrons of a corporal still stitched to the sleeve, and a wide, brimmed slouch hat, pulled low over eyes the color of wet slate. He carried a Spencer repeating carbine slung across his back, 2 Colt Army revolvers at his hips in a cross, draw rig he had cut himself from harness leather, and a Bowie knife in his right boot. He had no horse. He had walked the last 60 miles from the Texas border through country where a black man traveling alone was generally considered fair game for anyone who wanted his weapons or his life. He had not been bothered. The reasons for that would become clear to the people of Boggy Depot in the months that followed. His name, he told Angus McCrae when he came into the store to buy salt pork and coffee, was Jeremiah Walker. He had served 3 years in the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, had been at the Battle of Honey Springs, had been wounded twice, and had been mustered out at Fort Leavenworth in 1865 with a discharge paper, a back pay voucher the Army had refused to honor, and the brand of his former owner still legible on his left shoulder. McCrae looked him over once, saw the way Walker stood with his back to the corner of the store and his eyes on the door, recognized the look of a man who had decided long ago that he would never be taken alive, and counted out the goods without comment. He even threw in a small bag of dried apples. Years later, when McCrae was an old man and most of the people in this story were dead, he told a journalist from St. Louis that he had known from the moment Walker walked into his store that the country was about to change. though he had no way of guessing how much. The pieces of Walker's early life that have been recovered, mostly through the patient work of black historians at Howard University in the 1930s and 40s, paint a picture of a childhood designed to break a human being that somehow produced, through some combination of accident and ferocious will, the opposite. He had been born in 1846 on a cotton plantation in Adams County, Mississippi, the property of a planter named Josiah Whittington, who owned roughly 200 enslaved people and ran his operation on what he called scientific principles, meaning he had read the agricultural journals of the period and concluded that maximizing profits meant breaking slave families apart and selling the children when they reached working age, on the theory that workers without family attachments were less likely to escape and more likely to stay focused on their tasks. Walker's mother, whose name in the plantation ledgers was given only as Hannah, had been sold south to Louisiana when Jeremiah was 9. He never saw her again. His father, whose identity Walker himself never knew with certainty, was probably a free blacksmith from Natchez, who had been allowed brief visits to the plantation under tightly controlled conditions and who disappeared from local records in 1853, possibly murdered, possibly fled, at 11. Walker was sold to a cotton planter in northern Louisiana, the man whose initials would be burned into his shoulder and who treated him with a casual brutality that was, by the standards of the time and place, neither unusual nor noteworthy. Walker escaped at 15 in 1861 during the chaos of the early war and made his way north through the Mississippi swamps to Union lines, where he was eventually directed to a recruiting station in Kansas that was enlisting black soldiers for what would become the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. He served with distinction for 3 years. He learned to read in the regimental school, taught by a Quaker chaplain from Pennsylvania, who would later remember him in a published memoir as the most quietly intelligent young man the chaplain had ever encountered, with a memory that retained everything and an instinct for tactics that would have made him an officer in any army, that allowed black men to wear officers' insignia. The Union Army did not allow this. Walker was discharged as a corporal, having been recommended for promotion to sergeant on 3 separate occasions and denied each time on grounds the regulations of the period prohibited. What happened over the next 18 months in the territory between the Red River and the Canadian River is documented in pieces in the records of the Choctaw Lathors, in the dispatches of the federal marshals at Fort Smith, in the private correspondence of Texas cattlemen, and in the oral histories that black families in eastern Oklahoma still tell their children, though now they tell them quietly, because the descendants of those who hunted Jeremiah Walker still live in those same counties, and old grudges in that country have a way of outliving the men who first conceived them. By the spring of 1868, Walker had assembled around him a band of men so improbable in its composition that the federal authorities at first refused to believe the reports they were receiving. There were 7 black freedmen, all former Union soldiers like Walker himself, including a Tennessean named Cassius Pettigrew, who had been a regimental scout and could read sign on Bear Rock. There were 4 Comanche warriors, led by a man called Tabernanica, Sound of the Sun, who had lost his entire family to a Texas Ranger raid in 1864 and saw the new alliance as a continuation of his war against white settlers by other means. There were 3 Mexican brothers from the Nueces Strip, Ignacio, Raymond, and Severino Quintanilla, whose father had been hanged by Anglo vigilantes during the so-called Cart War, and who brought with them the brutal efficiency of borderland feuds. There were 2 white men, both Confederate guerrillas, who had ridden with William Quantrill, and had no place left in the post-war world. A Missourian named Ellis Tatum and a Kentuckian named Calvin H. Horton. There was an old Choctaw freedman named Solomon Beams, who had been the slave of a Choctaw planter before the war, and now served the band as cook, scout, and unofficial diplomat with the 5 civilized tribes. And there was a woman, which the federal records found particularly difficult to accept. A black woman of perhaps 25 named Delia Ransom, who had escaped a Louisiana plantation at 15 and spent the war years working as a laundress for a Union cavalry regiment, where she had learned to handle a pistol with both hands and to read maps with the quick instinct of a born tactician. She rode with the band as an equal, planned several of its most successful raids, and was, according to the only surviving photograph of her, a woman of striking and severe beauty, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed focused on something 100 yards beyond whatever was actually in front of her. The gang did not steal cattle, which is what made them dangerous. Cattle thieves were a known quantity in the territory, easily organized against, easily hunted down by cattlemen's associations and the newly formed stock detective agencies. What Jeremiah Walker's band stole was money, in quantities no frontier outlaw had previously imagined possible. Their first major operation, in April of 1868, was the robbery of a payroll wagon belonging to the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad, which was trying to push its line west across the Indian Territory. The wagon was carrying 128 Zerolozand in Union greenbacks intended to pay the railroad's construction crews. It was guarded by 12 armed men, including 4 Pinkerton agents brought in specifically because the railroad anticipated trouble. The wagon was struck at 300 in the morning by a force the surviving guards estimated at 30 riders, though Walker's entire band never numbered more than 20. The attack was over in less than 4 minutes. 3 guards were killed, including 2 Pinkertons. The rest were stripped of their weapons and tied to trees. The money was loaded onto pack mules and carried east into the Comanche Mountains, where it disappeared into a network of caves the Choctaw freedmen had used as hiding places during the war. None of it was ever recovered. The surviving guards, when they were finally able to give coherent statements at Fort Smith, spoke of an attack that didn't feel like an attack at all. There had been no shouted demands, no warning shots, no announcement of intentions. There had been instead a sudden silence, the kind of silence that drops on a forest when a predator has entered it. The silence of every small animal holding its breath at once. The 2 lead horses pulling the wagon had collapsed simultaneously, killed by what proved on examination to be 2 perfectly placed rifle shots fired from a distance of more than 300 yards by marksmen the guards never saw. Then the riders had emerged from the timber on both sides of the road, riding at a slow walk, their faces covered with dark cloth, their guns held at the ready, but not pointed at anyone in particular, the way a man holds a gun when he is so certain of his ability to use it that he sees no need to threaten. 3 of the guards, including the senior Pinkerton, had tried to draw their weapons. They were shot dead before their hands completed the movement. By riders no one saw aim. The other guards raised their hands. They were ordered. In a calm voice one of them later described as sounding like a country school teacher giving instructions to a particularly slow class. To dismount, remove their gun belts, walk to designated trees, and put their wrists together behind the trunks. They complied. They were tied with cord that had been cut to exactly the right length in advance. They were searched, and any small valuables on their persons, watches, rings, small amounts of personal cash, were pointedly left untouched. Only the railroad money, the company money, was taken. One of the guards, a young Pinkerton from Pennsylvania, on his first Western assignment, had started to cry, and one of the masked riders dismounted, walked over to him, and offered him a sip from a flask of whiskey. The young man accepted. The rider patted him on the shoulder, returned to his horse, and rode away. By the time a passing freight wagon found them at dawn, the guards had been tied to their trees for nearly 5 hours, and the only thing any of them could agree on with certainty was that the men who had attacked them had not been ordinary outlaws. They had been, one guard said, soldiers. The kind of soldiers who had survived the war by becoming better at killing than the people trying to kill them, and then had decided, for reasons no one understood, to keep going. What disturbed the Pinkerton agency more than the loss of the money was the discovery, when the surviving guards were untied, that each of them had a small piece of paper pinned to his shirt. The papers all said the same thing, in a careful schoolmaster's hand. "We could have killed you. We chose not to. Tell your masters that the next time the choice will be different." The Pinkerton agency didn't know what to do with this. The agency had been founded 20 years earlier by a Scottish abolitionist, Alan Pinkerton, who had run safe houses on the Underground Railroad, and who in his younger days would probably have understood what Jeremiah Walker was doing better than any man alive. But by 1868, Pinkerton had become the chief private police force of the American railroads and the Eastern banking interests, and his agents in the field were instructed to treat Walker's band as a simple criminal conspiracy and bring its members in alive if possible, dead if not. The agency assigned its best man, a former Chicago detective named Patrick Donovan, to coordinate the hunt. Donovan was a hard man, an Irish immigrant who had risen through the agency by being smarter and more ruthless than the men around him. And he understood from the beginning that this would not be an ordinary chase. He arrived at Fort Smith in May of 1868, sat down with the federal marshal there, a former Union general named James Fagan, and asked a single question. How does a man hide 20 riders, 4 of them Comanche, in country where every cattleman, every settler, every passing teamster will report a strange face within a day? Fagan didn't have an answer. Neither did Donovan. The answer, when it finally became apparent 2 years later, would shock the federal government into a level of secrecy that kept the truth out of newspapers for the rest of the century. The answer was that Jeremiah Walker was not hiding. He was being protected by a network of people across 3 states and the Indian Territory who had decided, each in their own way and for their own reasons, that whatever Jeremiah Walker was doing was something that needed to be done. The first hint of this network came in the summer of 1868, when a Pinkerton informant in the Choctaw town of Dokesville reported that wagons of supplies had been moving in and out of the Comanche Mountains for months with the apparent knowledge and cooperation of the Choctaw Lythorse police, who were turning a deliberate blind eye. Donovan investigated, found the informant murdered 3 days after he had filed his report. His body left in the middle of the main street of Dokesville with a single playing card pinned to his chest. It was the King of Spades. No one in Dokesville had seen anything. No one knew anything. When Donovan threatened to bring federal troops in, the Choctaw chief, a man named Allen Wright, a graduate of Union College who had once translated the Bible into the Choctaw language, looked at him with the patience contempt of a man who had been dealing with white officials his entire life, and said only that the Choctaw Nation was a sovereign government under the treaties of 1866, that federal troops could not enter without Choctaw consent, and that consent would not be given. The implication was clear. Walker had the protection of the Choctaw government, or at least of enough of its officials to make that protection effective. Donovan returned to Fort Smith and sent a long telegram to Pinkerton headquarters in Chicago. The response from Allen Pinkerton himself, a copy of which survives in the agency's archives, was one of the strangest documents in the history of American law enforcement. It instructed Donovan to proceed with the investigation, but to use, quote, particular discretion in any actions that might bring the matter to public attention. Pinkerton himself, the old abolitionist, seemed to understand that something complicated was happening on the southwestern frontier. Something that didn't fit neatly into the categories of law and crime. And he was reluctant to bring the full weight of his agency down on it without first knowing what he would be destroying. If you are still listening to me, and I hope you are, then I want you to take a moment right now to hit that like button, because the algorithm only shows this kind of buried American history to people who actively engage with it. And the families who have spent 150 years trying to keep this story buried have done a very effective job. Every like, every comment, every share helps another person discover what really happened in the territory in the years after the Civil War. And if you have a theory about what was really going on in the Comanche Mountains, leave it in the comments. Because what we are about to discover is that the truth was stranger and darker than even Patrick Donovan was prepared to imagine. In the autumn of 1868, Walker's band struck again, this time hitting a stagecoach carrying the Choctaw Nation's annuity payment, money the federal government had owed the tribe under the Treaty of 1866, and had finally agreed to pay in coin, rather than the depreciated paper currency the tribes had learned to refuse. The coach was carrying 19 $1,000 in gold double eagles. It was guarded by a detachment of the 6th United States Cavalry. The cavalry detachment was wiped out. 8 troopers killed in a single volley from rifles fired from positions on both sides of the road. And the gold was taken. But this was not what made the robbery famous. What made it famous was what Walker did next. Within 2 weeks, every Choctaw freedman family in the eastern half of the Choctaw Nation had received, by means no investigation could ever quite trace, a small leather pouch containing exactly the 20 in gold double eagles. There were nearly 700 such families in the affected area. The math worked out almost exactly to the amount stolen, with a small remainder that the freedmen insisted had been used to buy school books for the children. The federal investigators who interviewed these families found, to their fury, that none of the recipients would say a word about who had brought the gold or how it had arrived. The pouches simply appeared on doorsteps in the night with no note, no explanation. When pressed, the freedmen said only that the Lord worked in mysterious ways and looked at the federal agents with expressions that combined politeness, patience, and a deep, ancient amusement the agents found impossible to penetrate. Patrick Donovan understood, when he read the reports, exactly what had happened. Walker was not a thief. He was not even, in the conventional sense, an outlaw. He was a redistributor, an inverted Robin Hood operating in a post-war landscape where the federal government had failed in its most basic obligations to the people it had freed, and where the railroads and cattle barons were busily seizing every acre of land and every dollar of wealth they could get their hands on before anyone could organize effective resistance. Walker was the resistance. By the spring of 1869, the band had carried out at least 11 major operations, including the robbery of 2 more railroad payrolls, the looting of a Wells Fargo express office in Texarkana, the interception of a herd of Texas cattle being driven north to Kansas by a syndicate of speculators who had cheated Comanche families out of their treaty grazing rights, and a daring raid on the bank of Sherman, Texas, which had foreclosed on dozens of small farms owned by freedmen and Mexican families during the Panic of 1867. The bank's vault was emptied of $41,000. The bank's records, including the foreclosure files, were burned in the street. Within a month, deeds to the foreclosed properties began appearing in the mail of the dispossessed families, accompanied by notarized statements indicating the bank had reconsidered its position and was returning the land. The notary stamps were forged, but the deeds themselves were genuine. They had been removed from the bank's vault during the robbery, and someone with extensive legal knowledge had transferred them properly through the county recorder's office, using a clerk who had been bribed, blackmailed, or otherwise persuaded to cooperate. The federal authorities tried to challenge the deeds in court. The court, presided over by a judge appointed during Reconstruction and sympathetic to the freedmen, ruled that the transfers were legal on their face and that the federal government had no standing to contest them. The dispossessed families kept their land. The bank, ruined by the loss and the publicity, closed its doors within 6 months. Patrick Donovan, reading the reports from his office in Fort Smith, began to develop what he later described in a private letter to his wife as a peculiar admiration for his quarry, an admiration he found morally troubling and professionally dangerous. He wrote that he had begun to understand why Walker had become a kind of folk hero in the territory, why the songs about him sung by black families in the Cotton Bottoms had begun to spread to the cattle camps and railroad work crews, why even some white settlers, particularly small farmers and Confederate veterans who had themselves been ruined by the war, were starting to view Walker but as an outlaw, but as a man taking back some stolen action on what had been stolen from the winning side, from everyone that wasn't rich enough to be on the winning side of the new American economy. Donovan understood all of this, and he also understood that his job was to capture or kill Jeremiah Walker, and that his job was not negotiable. In the summer of 1869, Donovan made his first serious attempt. He assembled a force of 40 men, including 20 Pinkerton agents, 12 Texas Rangers under a notorious captain named Leander McNelly, and 8 federal marshals from Fort Smith. The force was equipped with new Henry repeating rifles, plenty of ammunition, and the best horses the agency could buy. They had received intelligence from an informant, a freedman named Cyrus Burdett, who had briefly ridden with Walker's band and had been turned by the offer of a federal pardon and 1,000 in cash. That Walker's main camp was in a hidden valley in the Comanche Mountains, called by the Choctaw the Valley of the Whispering Pines, accessible only through a single narrow defile. The band kept guarded day and night. Donovan's force rode out from Fort Smith on the morning of June 3, 1869. They were to rendezvous with Burdett at a crossroads near the town of Tuskahoma, where he would lead them by a back route into the valley, bypassing the main defile. They reached the crossroads at dusk. Burdett was waiting for them. He was sitting against a tree, his hands tied behind his back, his throat cut from ear to ear, his eyes still open. Pinned to his shirt was a playing card, the King of Spades. Donovan understood instantly what had happened. Burdett had been doubled. He had pretended to take the federal money while reporting everything he learned back to Walker. Walker had used him to lure the federal force into a trap. Donovan ordered his men to spread out into a defensive perimeter and prepare for an attack. The attack came at moonrise. The moon that night was a 3/4 moon, rising late and bright through the pine tops. And the men who survived what happened next would never afterward be able to sit comfortably in a dark forest, or hear the sound of horses' hooves on pine needles, or smell wood smoke on a summer night, without feeling the hair on their arms stand up. It came from every direction at once, from positions the band had clearly prepared days in advance, with crossfires that pinned the federal force in a small clearing surrounded by dense timber. The first volley killed 6 men in the space of a single breath, men who had been standing or kneeling in positions they thought offered some protection, but that had in fact been chosen for them by the marksmen in the trees, who had used the federal force's own defensive instincts to guide them into the kill zone. The return fire was wild. The federal men fired at muzzle flashes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that moved between shots that never came twice from the same position. Captain McNelly of the Texas Rangers, a famously aggressive officer who had spent 4 years fighting Mexican bandits along the Rio Grande, tried to lead a charge into the timber on the south side of the clearing. He was shot through the neck before he had taken 5 steps and died slowly over the next 10 minutes, while his men crouched behind fallen logs, watched him bleed, and were unable to move to help him without drawing the same fire. The voice of Jeremiah Walker himself, or of someone speaking for him, called out at one point from somewhere in the darkness, in English clear enough to carry across the clearing, telling the federal men to lay down their weapons and stand up with their hands empty, and they would not be killed. Donovan, bleeding from a shoulder wound that had nearly killed him, made the decision he would second guess for the rest of his life. He ordered his men to surrender. The fight lasted less than an hour. When it was over, 16 of Donovan's 40 men were dead. 12 more were wounded. The remainder, including Donovan himself, were stripped of their weapons, their horses, and their uniforms, and left to walk the 40 miles back to Fort Smith in their underclothes. None of Walker's band, as far as anyone could tell, had been killed or even wounded. When Donovan staggered into Fort Smith 3 days later, sunburned, dehydrated, with a tag pinned to his bare chest reading the same 5 words that had appeared on the wagon guards a year earlier. "We could have killed you. We chose not to." The federal marshal, James Fagan, sent a telegram to Washington requesting authorization to raise a force of regular Army cavalry, at least a regiment, to clear the territory of what he called, in the language of the time, the Negro insurrectionary band led by the freedman Walker. The War Department's response, when it finally came, was to deny the request. The reasons for the denial would not become clear for another 50 years, when the relevant files were finally open to historians. The truth, which the War Department understood and James Fagan did not, was that Jeremiah Walker's operations had become entangled in a much larger political conflict, one involving the Reconstruction policies of the Grant administration, the legal status of the freedmen in the Western Territories, and the desperate efforts of the railroads and cattle interests to seize control of the Indian Territory before any effective federal authority could be established there. To send a regiment of cavalry into the territory to hunt down a band that included Comanche warriors and was protected by the Choctaw government would, the War Department feared, trigger exactly the kind of larger Indian war that General Sherman was trying to avoid. It would also, less officially but perhaps more importantly, draw national attention to the fact that the federal government was failing catastrophically to protect the freedmen and was in many respects allowing the South to reimpose a system of de facto slavery through the convict lease system. The Black Codes and the rising tide of clan violence that federal authorities were either unable or unwilling to suppress. Walker was an embarrassment. The cavalry would make him a martyr. Better to let the Pinkertons handle it quietly, out of the public eye, and hope the problem would eventually solve itself through the slow attrition of arrests, betrayals, and natural causes that eventually consumed every outlaw band. That was the policy the Grant administration adopted. Patrick Donovan was instructed to continue his pursuit with whatever resources the agency could provide and keep the matter out of the newspapers. Donovan, who had nearly died in the Valley of the Whispering Pines, accepted his orders with a grim sense of finally understanding the kind of country he was working for. What followed were 3 years of a strange, slow, deeply secret war fought in the canyons, bottoms, and small towns of the Indian Territory, the Texas borderlands, and the cotton districts of southwestern Arkansas. Walker's band continued to operate, hitting selected targets with surgical precision, never striking the same place twice, never killing more than the operation required, always leaving behind their playing cards and tagged messages. They robbed 2 more bank vaults, 3 more railroad payrolls, an army quartermaster wagon carrying 60,000 in cash for frontier garrisons, and most spectacularly, in October of 1870, attacked and looted a riverboat called the Memphis Belle as it lay tied up at a wood landing on the Arkansas River. Taking an estimated 190,000 in cash and bullion, the boat was carrying south for a consortium of New Orleans cotton factors. In each case, the proceeds disappeared into the network of caves, sympathetic farmers, and quietly bribed officials Walker had constructed across 3 states. In each case, within weeks of the robbery, freedmen families, dispossessed Indian families, ruined small farmers, and Mexican families displaced by Anglo cattle barons would receive small, unmarked packages of cash, deeds returned from foreclosure, livestock stolen from them years earlier that had reappeared at their gates with no explanation. Walker had built, in effect, a parallel economy, a redistributive system funded by armed expropriation from the largest concentrations of capital in the post-war economy, and operated through a network of mutual aid that crossed every line of race, religion, and language in the borderlands. Patrick Donovan understood all of this, and the more he understood it, the more he found himself, against his will and against his orders, beginning to admire the man he had been sent to destroy. He wrote in his journal, which his granddaughter would discover in an attic in Chicago in 1947 and eventually deposit at the Newberry Library, that Walker was the most dangerous man in America, not because he was killing white people, but because he was demonstrating that an alternative to the developing American economy was possible, and that this alternative could be defended by men and women willing to die for it. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Comanche country intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The thing that finally broke the band, the thing no investigation by the Pinkertons or federal marshals had been able to accomplish, was something no one had foreseen. It was not betrayal, though there had been many attempted betrayals over the years. It was not military force, though Donovan continued to assemble and dispatch posses with grim regularity. It was, in the end, a combination of personal grief and strategic miscalculation. The same combination that has destroyed every armed resistance movement in human history. Sooner or later, in the spring of 1872, Delia Ransom was pregnant. The father was Jeremiah Walker himself, with whom Delia had been intimate, the records suggest, since at least 1868, though their relationship had been kept carefully concealed, even from the rest of the band. Both because Walker believed personal attachments made a man vulnerable, and because Delia herself had insisted on operating as an equal commander, not as a wife or consort. The pregnancy changed everything. Walker, who had survived a childhood in slavery, 3 years of war, and 4 years, as the most hunted man in the Western Territories, found himself for the first time in his life confronting the possibility of something he had never allowed himself to imagine: a future, a child, a family. The record suggests he and Delia began in the summer of 1872 to plan their withdrawal from the band. They would not abandon operations entirely but shift to a quieter role, advisory rather than operational, allowing younger men like Cassius Pettigrew and Tabernanica's nephew, a young Comanche warrior named P.O. Quasho, to take over leadership. Walker and Delia would relocate with the child to a small farm in the Choctaw Nation that had been quietly purchased in Solomon Beams's name, where they would try to live out whatever years remained to them as ordinary people. It was a beautiful plan. It was a sentimental plan. It was, as Walker himself probably understood, a plan no man in his position had any right to make. The plan was discovered by Patrick Donovan in October of 1872 through a piece of dumb luck so improbable that Donovan himself, in his journal, attributed it to the direct intervention of God, in whom he had not previously believed. A Choctaw freedman named Ezekiel Folsom, distantly related to the saloon owner Pushmatara Folsom and to the Choctaw chief, had been arrested in Fort Smith on a charge of horse theft. To save himself from a long sentence, he offered information. He had heard from his cousin, who worked at the recorder's office in Tuskahoma, that a deed had recently been registered for a small farm near the town of Atoka in the name of Solomon Beams. Folsom did not know who Solomon Beams was. He did not know why this information should be valuable. He offered it as part of a list of small gossip he hoped would buy his freedom. Donovan, sitting across the desk from him, recognized the name instantly. He had seen it in the reports for years, mentioned in passing as one of Walker's associates. The deed was the first concrete connection between Walker's band and a piece of identifiable fixed property anywhere in the territory. It was a thread. Donovan pulled it. What he found when he pulled the thread was the entire pattern. The farm at Atoka had been purchased with cash. The cash had been deposited in a bank in Sherman, Texas, by a freight agent named Augustus Blandon. Blandon had received the cash from a Choctaw merchant named Cyrus Pitchlin. Pitchlin was the brother-in-law of Pushmataha Folsom, the saloon owner in Boggy Depot. Pushmataha Folsom was the principal supplier of whiskey to the Comanche Mountains. By following the money, Donovan was able, over the course of 3 months, to map the entire commercial infrastructure of Walker's network. Every saloon keeper, every freight agent, every bribed clerk, every sympathetic farmer who had been moving supplies and information for the band for the past 4 years. He did not move on any of them. Instead, he watched, he waited, he compiled. By February of 1873, Donovan had assembled a list of 147 individuals across 3 states and the Indian Territory who were materially involved in supporting Walker's operations. He had also identified, with reasonable confidence, the location of the farm at Atoka, where Walker and Delia Ransom were planning to retire after the birth of their child, expected in the late spring. Donovan did something then that no Pinkerton agent had done before. He went directly to Allen Pinkerton himself, in Chicago, and laid out the entire case. He explained what Walker had built. He explained what the network was, what it did, why the freedmen, the Indians, the Mexican families, and the ruined white farmers were protecting it. He explained that any attempt to destroy the band by force, even now, with all this intelligence in hand, would create martyrs and would harden the network into a permanent insurgency the federal government would never be able to suppress without a level of violence that would be politically impossible. He proposed instead a different approach. He proposed to make Walker an offer. The offer, as Donovan finally presented it through an intermediary in March of 1873, was this: Walker and Delia Ransom could keep the farm at Atoka. They could keep their unborn child. They would receive federal pardons, signed personally by President Grant, for all crimes committed by them or any member of their band during their years of operation. In exchange, they would disband the band, return to private life, and use their remaining moral authority among the freedmen and Indian peoples of the territory to discourage any further organized resistance to the federal government and the developing American economy. They would, in effect, sell out. The intermediary was Solomon Beams, the old Choctaw freedman cook whom Donovan had been holding in protective custody at Fort Smith for 2 months, without filing any charges. Donovan had treated Beams well, fed him at the marshal's table, allowed him to write letters to his family. He had also explained to him, with patient clarity, what would happen to the entire network of 147 people, including Beams's own wife and 3 children, if the offer was rejected. Beams understood. He carried the offer back into the Comanche Mountains. He delivered it to Walker personally, in the Valley of the Whispering Pines, on a cold March evening in 1873. What was said between them is not recorded, because Solomon Beams refused for the rest of his long life to discuss it with any white man. And the only people he ever told the full story to were 3 black ministers in eastern Oklahoma, all of whom died without writing it down. What is known is that Walker accepted the offer. He understood, the way Donovan had hoped he would understand, that the cost of refusal would be paid not by him, but by everyone who had stood with him for the past 5 years, and that he had no right to ask them to pay that cost for the sake of his own pride or his own continued resistance. The plan was set for the night of April 17, 1873. Walker would meet Donovan at a remote cabin near the Texas border, where the formal pardons would be signed and the disbandment would begin. Walker would come alone. Donovan would come alone. The agreement was witnessed by Solomon Beams and by a Choctaw judge named Allen Wright, the same Allen Wright who had been chief of the nation when Donovan had first investigated the Dokesville murder 5 years earlier, and who had agreed, after considerable pressure, to serve as guarantor of the federal government's good faith. Walker arrived at the cabin at midnight on April 17, alone, on a horse, carrying no weapons. Donovan was waiting for him. The pardons were signed. The 2 men shared a bottle of whiskey, the first time, Walker remarked, he had ever drunk with a white lawman. They talked for several hours about the war, about the territory, about the future. Donovan wrote in his journal that Walker spoke of his unborn child with a softness he had not expected from a man who had killed perhaps 50 other men over the course of his career. He wrote that Walker had asked him, at one point during the long night, whether he thought the Grant administration would actually honor the pardon, whether it would hold in any court, whether the land at Atoka would remain in his name if some ambitious prosecutor decided to challenge it 5 years from now. Donovan had said honestly that he did not know. He had said he had done everything he could within his authority to make the agreement binding, that the pardon bore the president's signature, that the Choctaw judge Allen Wright had agreed to serve as witness and guarantor, but that the United States government was not in the habit of keeping its promises to black men or to Indians, and that Walker would be a fool to trust any piece of paper that came out of Washington. Walker had smiled at this, a small, private smile that Donovan would remember for the rest of his life, and said only that he was tired, that he had been tired for 10 years, and that he had decided a foolish trust was preferable to the alternative, to spend the rest of his life running from men like Donovan, to raise his child on the run to watch his child grow up expecting to be killed the way his father and grandfather had been killed. He had said he had made his peace with the possibility that the pardon would not hold, and that if it did not, at least he would have tried. He had said that this was what he was giving up the band for. Not for the farm, not for the pardons, but for the chance, however small, of a life that was not defined by the expectation of violence. They parted before dawn. Walker rode north, back toward the Choctaw Nation and the farm at Atoka, where Delia was waiting. Donovan rode east, back toward Fort Smith, with the signed agreement in his saddlebag. What happened next was something Patrick Donovan had not anticipated, that no one in the federal government had anticipated, and that demonstrated, with terrible finality, that the network Walker had built was not actually under Walker's control, and had perhaps never been. The 17 men who had been hunting Walker for the previous 6 weeks, the Pinkerton agents, Texas Rangers, and federal deputies, whose bodies the marshal would find a few weeks later, arranged in their perfect circle around the dying campfire, had not known about Donovan's negotiation. They had been operating under the older orders, to capture or kill Walker on sight. They had been close. They had picked up his trail 2 days before the meeting with Donovan, and they had been closing in on the cabin when Walker rode away from it at dawn. They caught up with Walker at mid-morning on April 18 in a small ravine about 12 miles south of the Red River in Texas. They surrounded him. They demanded his surrender. Walker, who was carrying no weapons, because he had ridden to the meeting with Donovan unarmed as a gesture of good faith, raised his hands and showed them the signed federal pardon. The leader of the posse, a Texas Ranger captain named Mariah Hollister, took the pardon, read it, and threw it on the ground. He told Walker he did not recognize the authority of any pardon issued by the Grant administration. He said his orders came from the state of Texas and from the cattlemen's associations that funded his work, and those orders had not changed. He gave Walker 30 seconds to draw a weapon and defend himself. Walker, who still had no weapons, simply stood there. Hollister shot him through the chest from a distance of 12 feet. Walker fell. Hollister rode forward, dismounted, and put a second bullet through Walker's head as he lay dying in the dust. He then ordered the body hung from the nearest tree as a warning. The body was hung. The posse rode away. They did not know what they had done. They did not know about the network. They did not know about Delia ransom and the unborn child waiting at the farm in Atoka. They did not know that they had just executed the only man in 3 states who had been holding back something far older and far more dangerous than any organized outlaw band. They found out within 48 hours. Cassius Pettigrew was the first to reach the body. Alerted by a Comanche scout who had been shadowing Walker as he rode north from the meeting with Donovan, Pettigrew cut the body down. He buried it in an unmarked grave in a place that has never been discovered. He then sent runners in every direction across the network. The runners carried no message except a date, a place, and a deck of playing cards from which 17 specific cards had been removed. The remaining members of the band and the inner circle of the support network understood. They knew what was being asked. Within 6 weeks, every man who had been part of the posse that killed Jeremiah Walker, including Mariah Hollister, had been hunted down and killed. Each one shot once between the eyes. Each one left holding one of the 17 missing playing cards. Each one arranged in a pattern that was meaningless to the federal investigators who found the bodies, but that when the cards were eventually combined and read in the order the men had died, spelled out, in a code based on a Comanche counting system, the simple words, "This debt is paid, a Patrick Donovan." When he finally understood what had happened, requested a leave of absence from the Pinkerton agency. He went to Chicago. He spent 3 weeks drinking alone in a hotel room. He wrote a long letter to Alan Pinkerton, explaining that he was resigning from the agency, that he could no longer continue in a profession that had used him, against his knowledge, and against his explicit assurances, to lure a man to his death under the false promise of a federal pardon. Pinkerton refused to accept the resignation. He explained, in a private meeting that Donovan recorded in his journal, that Maria Hollister had not been operating under federal orders, that his actions had been unauthorized and were, in a strict legal sense, a state crime, and that the federal government could not be held responsible. Donovan understood that this was true in the narrowest legal sense and false in every meaningful sense. He understood that the federal government had created the conditions under which Hollister could believe his orders had not changed. By failing to communicate the pardon to field operatives, by failing to coordinate the various agencies hunting Walker, by failing fundamentally to want Walker to live. He understood that Walker had been killed not by Hollister, who had merely fired the bullets, but by the United States government, which had decided that an alternative American economy could not be allowed to exist. He stayed at the agency because he had nowhere else to go and a family to support. But he never worked another case in the territory, and he never spoke to Alan Pinkerton again except through subordinates. He died in 1907 in Chicago of pneumonia at the age of 73. His last words, according to his daughter, who was present at the bedside, were the name, Jeremiah, repeated twice. What happened to Delia Ransom and the child? You may ask. What happened to the network of 147 people who had supported Walker for 5 years? What happened to the farm at Atoka, where Walker had been planning to live out his years as an ordinary man? The answers are recorded in pieces in family histories, in the oral traditions of the freedmen, the Choctaw, and the Comanche. But they have never been fully assembled, and probably never will be. Delia Ransom gave birth to a son in May of 1873. She named him Jeremiah after his father. She left the Choctaw Nation within a month of the birth, traveling first to New Orleans and then by ship to Liberia, where a small community of black expatriates from the American South had been trying for 50 years to build a free republic on the west coast of Africa. She arrived in Monrovia in November of 1873. She lived there under the name Delia Walker until her death in 1904. Her son grew up in Liberia, was educated at the College of West Africa, became a lawyer, and eventually returned to the United States in the 1910s, where he became one of the early organizers of what would eventually become the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He died in 1949 having lived an entire life without ever publicly acknowledging the identity of his father. Though he wrote in a private letter to his own son that he had been told the story when he was 12 years old by his mother and had carried it with him every day of his life thereafter. The network of 147 people was never prosecuted. Donovan, in his last act of conscience as a Pinkerton agent, destroyed the list. He burned it himself in the fireplace of his hotel room in Chicago the week after he learned of Walker's death. The names existed nowhere else. The men and women on the list lived out their lives in their towns and on their farms across the territory, and the support they had given Walker remained for most of them a secret. They shared only with their children and grandchildren, in private, late at night, when the white world was not listening. The farm at Atoka was burned to the ground in 1875 by a group of night riders associated with the early Ku Klux Klan, who had heard rumors it had once belonged to Walker and wished to make a statement. The rumors were never confirmed. The land was sold for taxes in 1878 to a white settler from Kansas who had no idea what he was buying. The settler, whose name was Ebenezer Crowley, found when he plowed the south field for the first spring, planting a small leather pouch buried 6 inches below the surface. Inside the pouch were 20 gold double eagles, the last of the Choctaw annuity gold from the robbery of 1868, which Walker had buried on the farm he had hoped to live on, perhaps as a kind of insurance, perhaps simply as a habit of a man who had spent his entire life expecting everything could be taken from him at any moment. Crowley sold the gold to a bank in Atoka, used the money to buy a team of mules, and lived a long, uneventful life on the land where Jeremiah Walker had hoped to raise his son. He never knew what he had stumbled onto. He died in 1909, having mentioned the gold to no one but his wife. The story of Jeremiah Walker, the runaway slave who built the most dangerous gang the Western Territories had ever seen, was systematically suppressed by the federal government, by the Pinkerton Agency, by the cattle interests that had profited from his death, and by the dominant historical narrative of the American West, which had no place for a black man on horseback with a Spencer carbine and a network of 147 people across 3 states willing to die to protect him. The story survived in fragments, in the songs black families in eastern Oklahoma still sing without quite knowing what they mean, in the playing cards that occasionally appear in antique markets in Fort Smith and Texarkana, with strange numerical markings on their backs, in a small obelisk in a forgotten cemetery in the Choctaw Nation that bears no name, but is decorated every April 18 with a single bouquet of wild prairie flowers, placed there by hands that have never been seen. And that, after 150 years, must now belong to the great-great-great-grandchildren of people who knew the truth and refused to let it die. This mystery shows us that the history we are taught is rarely the history that actually happened, and that the most dangerous men in any society are not those who kill and steal for personal gain, but those who refuse to accept that the world as they find it is the only world that can exist. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Was Jeremiah Walker an outlaw, a hero, or something more complicated than either word can capture? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next one.